There are two kinds of cold in this world. There is the cold that bites at exposed skin, the honest cold of a November morning that stings your cheeks and reminds you that you are breathing, that blood still moves through your veins, that you are against all evidence alive. And then there is the other kind, the deep cold, the cold that does not bite but seeps. It gets into the bones of a house the way grief gets into the bones of a woman, slowly, silently, with absolute patience. It settles into the mortar between stones. It threads through the gaps in green-cut timber. It finds the crack you missed, the joint you thought was sealed, the place where your certainty was thinnest. And once it is inside, it does not leave. It whispers a single terrible promise, the same promise it has whispered to every living thing that ever dared to winter in these mountains. You will not see the spring. If this story of a woman who refused to listen to that whisper speaks to you, if you believe that the quiet voice of intuition can outlast the loudest chorus of experts, take a moment now and subscribe to this channel. You will find more stories like this one. Stories about forgotten knowledge, impossible choices, and the stubborn human will to survive. Now, let me tell you about Rowena Datch, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, September of 1881. The Copper Country, a land of black spruce and birch so white it looked like the bones of the earth poking through its skin. A land where Lake Superior crouched to the north like some vast cold-blooded animal breathing weather onto the shore in endless gray exhalations. The lake made its own storms. It pulled moisture from its 300-mile fetch of open water and hurled it against the hills in walls of snow so dense a man could lose his barn standing 10 feet from it. The miners called it lake effect. The Ojibwe called it the white mouth. Both names meant the same thing. It ate whatever stood in its way. The town of Calumet Ridge clung to the side of a granite ridge like a barnacle on the hull of a sinking ship. It existed for one reason and one reason only: copper. The Heckler Mining Company had driven shafts into the rock and pulled out ore that was 60% pure, and the town had assembled itself around those shafts the way a body assembles itself around a spine. There was a company store, a company boarding house, a company church. There were saloons that were not company-owned, but might as well have been. And there were the houses, rows of timber frame boxes built fast and cheap by the mining company's own carpenters, each one identical, each one drafty, each one heated by a cast-iron stove that ate cordwood the way the mine ate men, steadily, without gratitude and with no promise of return. Above the town, up where the road turned to mud and then to nothing, there was a different kind of dwelling. It sat on a small shoulder of land that jutted from the ridge like a crooked elbow. It was not a company house. It was a cabin built by a man who had seen something in the rock that the mining company had, not a man who looked at granite the way a poet looks at a blank page with the absolute conviction that there was meaning hidden in it. That man was Everett Datch. He was a geologist, self-taught, largely self-funded, and by the general consensus of Calumet Ridge, self-deluded. He was also dead. He had died in April. A tunnel he had been surveying on the eastern face of the ridge had collapsed without warning. 3 tons of fractured rock coming down in a sound that witnesses described as a single wet cough. They found him under the rubble with his leather journal still open in his left hand, a pencil stub in his right, and an expression on his face that one of the miners said looked less like fear than like surprise, as though the rock had interrupted him in the middle of a thought he very much wanted to finish. He left behind a wife, 2 children, a cabin made of more ambition than craft, and a wooden crate full of those leather journals. He also left behind the deed to 40 acres of ridgeland that the mining company considered worthless, because the prospect tunnel Everett had spent months digging by hand had yielded nothing but barren quartz, and an observation so strange he had underlined it 3 times. The rock at depth remains warm. Anomalous. Investigate. He never got the chance. Rowena Datch was 32 years old, and she had the kind of face that the women of Calumet Ridge found difficult to read. It was a narrow face, strong-boned, weathered in a way that might have been premature age or might have been something harder and more deliberate. Her hands were rough. Her hair, dark and heavy, was always pinned back in a way that suggested she had more important things to think about than hair. She moved through her days with a kind of focused economy, as though every motion had been rehearsed and found adequate, and all the unnecessary ones had been stripped away. She did not cry at the funeral. This was noted. She did not cry when the company foreman came to the cabin 3 days later and told her with the practiced sympathy of a man who has delivered bad news many times that Everett's death was ruled accidental and that the company bore no financial obligation. She did not cry when the minister's wife organized the first basket of charity, a collection of dry bread, salted pork, a jar of apple preserves, and a pair of children's stockings that were too small for either of her children. She thanked the minister's wife. She accepted the basket. She closed the door and set it on the table and stood looking at it for a long time, her hands flat on the rough pine surface, her breathing even and controlled. The bread was 3 days old. The preserves were from last year's crop, the kind you give away because the flavor has gone flat. The stockings had a darn in the heel. It was a gift assembled from the bottom of other people's pantries, and it carried a message as clear as if it had been written on a card and tucked between the bread and the pork. We are sorry for you. We expect you to fail. Here is something to ease the decline. Calder watched her from across the room. He was 8 years old, and he had his father's eyes, gray and observant, set deep under a brow that furrowed when he was thinking, which was nearly always. He did not ask his mother if she was all right. He could see that she was not all right, and that the question would be an insult to both of them. Instead, he went outside, found the axe, and began splitting kindling. The sound of it, a steady rhythmic cracking, carried through the thin cabin walls like a second heartbeat. Phoebe was 5. She sat on the floor near the stove, arranging the smooth pale stones her father had collected along the path to the front door. She arranged them in a circle, then in a line, then in a circle again, as though working through some private geometry that only she understood. When Rowena finally moved, Phoebe looked up and said the cabin was cold. Rowena said yes, it was. The cabin was a problem. Rowena could see this with the same clear, unsentimental eye that Everett had used to read the strata of the ridge. The logs were green felled spruce cut in haste during Everett's first summer on the claim. They had been full of sap, then fat and tight against each other. But green wood does not stay green. It dries, it shrinks, it twists. Gaps opened between the logs like missing teeth in a prizefighter's smile, and the chinking a crude mixture of clay and moss that Everett had pressed into the gaps with his bare hands was cracking and falling out in chunks. The roof was a single layer of split cedar shakes over pole rafters, and it leaked in 4 places that Rowena knew about, and probably 2 more she had not yet found. The floor was packed earth-cold and slightly damp, and the single window which Everett had placed with great care on the south wall to catch the morning sun was a pane of glass so thin you could see it flex when the wind pressed against it. She had a cast-iron stove. It was a good one, a Peninsula No. 4 that Everett had bought second-hand from a miner who was leaving for California. It worked hard, it burned hot, and it was losing. She could feel it in the mornings. She would wake before dawn, feed the stove until its belly glowed, and for 20 minutes the cabin would be almost warm. The air near the stove would shimmer with heat, but the warmth rose to the ceiling and pressed against the leaking shakes, and for every breath of hot air that escaped through the roof, a breath of cold air slid in under the door or through the gaps in the logs. The stove was trying to heat the cabin, and the cabin was trying to heat the sky, and the sky being infinite always won. By December, they would be burning 8 cords a month. She had 3.5 cords split and stacked. Even if she worked from dawn until dark every day, she could not cut enough. The mathematics of it were as cold and precise as the wind. The pity came in waves after that. It came in baskets left on the porch. It came in the careful sidelong glances of the women at the company store. It came in the lowered voices that stopped when she entered a room and resumed when she left. It came in the helpful suggestions that were not suggestions at all, but verdicts delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head. You should move down to town. The boarding house has a room. The laundry is hiring. Sell the land. The mining concern will give you a fair price for the timber rights. Think of the children. Always that last phrase. Think of the children. As though she thought of anything else. As though every decision she made, every log she split, every patch she pressed into the crumbling chinking was not an act of thinking about her children. Hollis Grieve came on a Tuesday in early October. He was the mine's surface foreman, a position that in Calumet Ridge carried roughly the same authority as a Roman governor. He was a large man broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that seemed designed for gripping things, and a voice that filled whatever room it entered, the way water fills a glass, completely leaving no space for anything else. He had built or supervised the building of nearly every structure in the lower town. He understood lumber and nails and the proper angle of a roofline the way a surgeon understands anatomy. These were not opinions to him. They were facts, and Hollis Grieve did not argue with facts. He stood on Rowena's porch. He did not sit. He looked at the roofline, at the gaps in the chinking, at the way the south wall had begun to bow slightly outward, where the sill log was rotting. He saw everything that was wrong, and everything that was wrong confirmed everything he already believed, which was that this cabin and this woman and this entire situation was a problem waiting for the obvious solution. Mrs. Datch. He removed his hat, which was a courtesy, and held it in both hands, which was a signal that he intended to be brief. I'll be direct. This structure will not survive what's coming. I have built houses in this country for 19 years. I know what holds and what doesn't. This doesn't hold. He put his hat back on. The Heckler Company has expressed interest in the timber rights on your parcel. The 40 acres of standing birch and spruce are worth something. The land itself without the mineral rights is worth less, but combined, you're looking at a fair settlement. Enough for a room in town and a start in honest work. The laundry, perhaps the company kitchen. He paused not for her response, but for the words to land and do their work. You have children, ma'am. Think of what's best for them. Rowena stood in the doorway. She was holding a dishcloth. Behind her, the stove ticked as the metal cooled. She looked at Hollis Grieve, at his thick, competent hands, at the absolute certainty in his face, and she felt the familiar weight settle in her chest, the stone of other people's pity. Thank you, Mr. Grieve. I'll consider it. She closed the door. She did not consider it. She wept that night after the children were asleep. She wept the next night, too. Not the frantic gasping sobs of panic, but a slow, steady, almost mechanical weeping, as though her body were draining something that needed to be drained before she could see clearly. Calder lay awake in his bunk and listened to it. He did not go to her. He understood with an intuition that was older than his 8 years that this weeping was not weakness. It was a process. Something was being burned away. On the third morning, Rowena did not weep. She rose before dawn, fed the stove, boiled water, made porridge, braided Phoebe's hair, and then sat down at the table and opened the crate. Everett's journals. She had not touched them since the funeral. She had carried the crate from the cabin to the root cellar and back to the cabin twice, unable to either open it or discard it. The leather covers smelled like him. The pages held the pressure of his hand. To read them was to hear his voice, and she was not sure she could bear to hear his voice say things she would never be able to answer. The first journal was dense with technical notation. Stratigraphic columns, mineral assays, cross-sections of the ridge, drawn in ink so precise they looked mechanical. She turned the pages, slowly touching the diagrams but not reading the text. She was not a geologist. She could not follow his mind through these layers of code. But the fourth journal was different. It was older than the others, the leather, softer the pages, foxed and water-stained. The handwriting was not Everett's. It was his but copied from another source. Transcriptions made carefully and annotated in Everett's own hand of conversations and observations from a man named Merritt Poldark. Poldark. She knew the name. An old Cornishman who lived alone in a cabin on the far side of the ridge. a former hard rock miner who had broken his hip in a shaft collapse years ago and now walked with a crutch fashioned from a birch limb. The miners called him Old Paul. The children were afraid of him. He spoke to almost no one, but he had spoken to Everett. The transcriptions were detailed and strange. They did not read like geology. They read like something older. Poldark spoke of stone not as a dead thing to be drilled and blasted, but as a material with memory. He spoke of the mines in Cornwall where men had worked copper and tin for 3,000 years, and of the houses built by the old Baal maidens, the mine women who understood that the earth itself was warm, and that a house built with the earth, not against it, could survive any winter. He spoke of masonry heaters, massive structures of stone and brick, with long winding internal channels that captured the heat of a fire and held it for a full day. He spoke of draft angles and thermal mass, and the specific heat capacity of granite. He spoke in the plain language of a man who had built things with his hands all his life and had no patience for theory that could not be touched. And in the margin of one page in Everett's handwriting, underlined 3 times, she found the words that changed everything. The rock at 50 feet stays warm even in January frost. Merritt says the Cornish knew this. The earth is not cold. It is the opposite. It is a slow furnace with a patient heart. Stone remembers fire, must investigate the Prospect Tunnel. Geothermal anomaly confirmed. Below this, a map. Their 40 acres sketched in quick, confident lines. The cabin, the creek, the stand of birch. And on the eastern slope, marked with a circled X, the notation Prospect Tunnel, 55 feet depth, barren quartz, warm rock. Rowena stared at the map. The Prospect Tunnel. The miners called it Datch's Folly. A hole Everett had spent 2 months digging by hand before the barren quartz convinced him there was no copper worth chasing. It was a scar on the hillside, a monument to failed ambition. A joke told in the saloons when men wanted to illustrate the difference between book learning and real knowledge. But Everett had not abandoned it because it was empty. He had abandoned it because it was the wrong kind of fool. Wrong for copper, but maybe right for something else entirely. She did not sleep. She sat at the table long after the oil lamp began to gutter, reading and rereading Poldark's words in her husband's careful hand. She read of masonry flues that captured 90% of a fire's heat instead of sending it up a chimney. She read of radiant warmth that heated objects and bodies directly instead of wasting itself on air. She read of the Earth's stable temperature at depth 55 degrees year-round, an enormous thermal reservoir that could be borrowed from but never exhausted. Men fight the winter with fire. A wise man invites the mountain into his home. Poldark's words, Everett's handwriting, a dead man's map to a warm room inside the earth. At first light, Rowena took the lantern. She told Calder to watch his sister. She told him she would be back within the hour. She walked to the eastern slope through the stand of birch, their white trunks luminous in the gray dawn, to the mouth of the Prospect Tunnel. It was choked. Rockfall and 2 seasons of brush had narrowed the entrance to a gap barely wider than a fox den. Thorny blackberry canes had woven themselves across the opening like barbed wire. She pulled them away with her bare hands, the thorns drawing thin lines of blood across her palms. She cleared rock piece by piece until the opening was wide enough for her body. She lit the lantern. She took one breath of the cold metallic morning air, and she crawled inside. The tunnel was narrow, roughly hewn, a tube of blasted rock, just wide enough for a man pushing a wheelbarrow. The ceiling scraped her back. The floor was rubble and standing water. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, something mineral and patient. She moved forward on her hands and knees, the lantern throwing wild shadows on the walls of quartz and mica that glittered like a cathedral made of broken glass. 10 feet in, the sound of the wind vanished. It did not fade. It stopped as though someone had closed a door between her and the world. 20 feet. The air was no longer cold. It was neutral, the temperature of a root cellar, neither warm nor cool, simply present. 30 feet. Her breath stopped blooming. She could feel something in the stone beneath her hands, a change so subtle she might have imagined it. 40 feet. The walls were dry now, the standing water gone. The rock had a different quality here, not the fractured, frost-shattered stone of the entrance, but solid, dense, unbroken granite. 55 feet. The tunnel ended in a face of solid rock. Everett's last drill marks were still visible, a constellation of small round holes where he had tested the vein and found nothing worth selling. Rowena set down the lantern. She pressed both palms flat against the granite face. It was warm. Not warm the way a sun-baked stone is warm, not the residual heat of some external source. This was deeper, intrinsic. The rock had a temperature that belonged to it the way a heartbeat belongs to a body. It was not hot. It was perhaps 60 degrees 62, but in the context of the killing cold that waited outside, in the context of the winter that was already sharpening its teeth on the ridgeline, 60 degrees was not a temperature. It was a miracle. She held her hands against the stone for a long time. She could feel the warmth moving into her skin, into her fingers, traveling up through her wrists, into her forearms. The earth's own heat, the slow furnace with its patient heart. Stone remembers fire. When she crawled back out into the morning, the light was blinding. Her dress was soaked with tunnel water. Her hands were bleeding from the thorns and raw from the rock. Her knees were bruised and her back ached from crawling. But the stone in her chest, the stone of pity, the weight of other people's certainty that she would fail, was gone. In its place was something else. Not confidence exactly. Something more dangerous than confidence. A plan so audacious, so fundamentally insane by every standard of Calumet Ridge, that if she spoke it aloud, the town would have her committed. She would not winter in the cabin. She would not sell the land. She would not take a room in the boarding house or a position in the laundry. She would take her children into the mountain. She told Calder that evening after Phoebe was asleep. She told him plainly without decoration, the way you tell a child something that is true and frightening and cannot be made less frightening by softening the language. We are going to live in the tunnel this winter. I am going to build a room inside the mountain and a stove made of stone that will keep us warm. Calder looked at her for a long time. He was sitting on his bunk, his legs dangling, his gray eyes steady. Is that what Papa's books say to do? Yes. Then we should do it. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, as a conclusion he had already reached before she finished speaking. He was 8 years old, and he had decided to trust his mother against the judgment of the entire world. It was the bravest thing Rowena had ever witnessed, and she had to turn away so he would not see her face. The work began the next morning, and it was brutal. It was a war fought with a pickaxe, a shovel, a wheelbarrow that had a cracked handle, and a wheel that squealed like a living thing. She widened the entrance first, cutting away rock with the pickaxe until the opening was tall enough to walk through, stooped and wide enough for the wheelbarrow. She hauled rubble out by the barrow load, her arms burning her lower back, a solid bar of pain that she learned to ignore the way you learn to ignore the sound of a clock. Calder helped. He could not swing the pickaxe, but he could load the wheelbarrow, and he did stone by stone, his small hands finding the edges and grips of each rock, with an instinct that reminded her so much of Everett, that she sometimes had to stop and press her fist against her mouth. She worked 12 hours a day. She ate standing up. She fell asleep in her clothes and woke in the dark and went back to the tunnel and worked by lantern light until the children needed her. She cleared the floor for the full 55-foot length, laying a bed of gravel for drainage, and then flat stones hauled from the creek bed, each one chosen for its shape and fitted against its neighbors like puzzle pieces. The town began to notice. At first, they thought she was shoring up the cabin's foundation, gathering rock for a retaining wall. A sensible task. They approved. But then she started mixing clay, coarse sand, and chopped straw in a shallow pit near the creek. She built a crude kiln from stacked fieldstone and began firing bricks. They were ugly. They were uneven. They were warped and cracked and bore the fingerprints of a woman who had never made a brick in her life. But they were hard. And she was not shoring up the cabin. She was building something inside the mountain. The whispers became conversations. The conversations became judgments. The pity that had weighed on Rowena like a wet blanket curdled into something with sharper edges. Concern became mockery. Mockery became a kind of communal certainty that was more dangerous than either, because it carried the force of consensus. The Dutch widow has gone mad. She's digging her own grave. She's dragging those children into the earth. Someone should do something. Nobody did anything. Pity is passive. It offers bread and stockings and sympathetic glances, but it does not climb a ridge in the cold to stop a woman with a pickaxe. They watched from below, and they shook their heads, and they told each other it was a tragedy, a slow-motion catastrophe, and they waited for the inevitable. And half a mile away on the far side of the ridge, in a cabin that was smaller and quieter than any in Calumet Ridge, Merritt Poldark sat on his porch with his birch limb crutch across his knees. He was 65 years old. His hair was white and thin. His hip ached in the cold, a deep grinding ache that lived in the bone like a tenant who refused to leave. He had worked the copper mines of Cornwall before he worked the copper mines of Michigan. And before that, his father had worked the tin mines of Penwith. And before that, his grandfather had cut stone for the engine houses that stood on every cliff in the West Country, like the skeletons of giants. He knew stone. He knew it the way a blind man knows the furniture in his own house by touch, by memory, by the accumulated understanding of a lifetime spent in intimate contact with a single material. He knew its moods and its capacities. He knew what it would bear and what it would not. He knew that it was not dead, that it held heat the way a good memory holds a name faithfully for a long time, and released it slowly, reluctantly, as though parting with something precious. He had taught these things to Everett Datch. The young geologist had come to him 2 summers ago carrying a journal full of questions that were better than any Merritt had heard in 40 years of mining. They had sat on this porch and talked about stone and heat and the old Cornish way of building, and Merritt had felt something he had not felt since his hip broke and ended his working life. He had felt useful. Now Everett was dead, and Everett's wife was digging into the mountain. Merritt could see the tunnel entrance from his porch if he squinted. He could see the small figure with the wheelbarrow moving back and forth like an ant building a hill, one grain at a time. He watched her for 3 weeks. He watched her make mistakes. He watched her mix the clay too wet. He watched her set the drainage gravel too shallow. He watched her begin to frame the internal chamber at the wrong depth, too close to the entrance where the cold air would still reach. He watched and he said nothing, and his hands gripped the crutch until his knuckles went white, because watching someone build wrong was for Merritt Poldark a physical pain worse than the hip. On the morning that he saw her begin to lay the first course of bricks for the flue channel, he saw her set the angle at 30 degrees. It should have been 45. At 30 degrees, the draft would be sluggish. The smoke would back up. The chamber would fill with carbon monoxide, and she and her children would fall asleep and never wake up. He stood. He took his crutch. He walked half a mile through the October mud with his broken hip screaming at every step. He did not do it out of pity. He did not do it out of kindness. He did it because he was a man who had built things correctly all his life, and the idea of a flue channel at 30 degrees was an offense against the order of the physical world that he could not allow to stand. He arrived at the tunnel entrance, breathing hard, his face gray with pain. Rowena was inside, kneeling in the lamplight, troweling clay mortar onto a misshapen brick. She heard the scrape of his crutch on the rock and turned. She saw a white-haired old man she had seen perhaps twice in 3 years standing in the entrance with an expression that was not sympathy or curiosity or judgment, but something far more specific. It was the expression of a craftsman looking at bad work. "Your flue angle is wrong. 30 degrees will kill you. 45 or nothing." He turned and left. Rowena knelt there with the trowel in her hand, the wet clay cooling on the brick. She looked at the flue channel she had spent 2 days building. She looked at the angle. She thought about Everett's journal, about the transcriptions of Poldark's own words. She thought about the old man's face, the way his eyes had gone straight to the floor, without pausing at anything else. She tore it down that afternoon. every brick, every joint. She started over at 45 degrees. Poldark came back the next morning. He brought a miner's square, a tool for measuring angles cut from a single piece of iron. He did not explain it. He set it on the ground near her work and stood watching with his arms crossed over the crutch. The firebox is too small. You need twice the volume for the initial burn. Short fire, hot fire. That is the principle. 2 hours of burning, 20 hours of heat. But only if the mass is sufficient and the channels are long enough. He spoke without looking at her, as though he were talking to the stone itself. Then he left. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He never announced himself. He never asked permission. He never praised her work. He corrected it. He pointed at mistakes with the end of his crutch and stated what was wrong in flat declarative sentences that contained no emotion whatsoever. The firebox throat is too narrow. Your mortar makes needs more right as sand. That joint will crack when it heats. Do it again. Rowena did it again and again and again. She learned to read his silence as approval and his crutch pointing as instruction. She learned that when he grunted and turned away without comment, it meant the work was acceptable. She learned that the single worst thing he could do was shake his head, because a head shake from Merritt Poldark meant you had to tear down everything you had built that day and begin from nothing. One evening after a week of this, Calder asked her who the old man was. She told him. Calder said the old man never smiled. No, Rowena said, but he came. She was building the masonry heater now, and it was the most complex thing she had ever attempted. It was a massive rectangular structure of brick and stone, 5 feet wide, 4 feet deep and 6 feet tall, positioned against the warm granite face at the deepest point of the tunnel. Inside its body was a labyrinth, a serpentine maze of channels that forced the smoke and hot gases to travel 70 feet of internal distance before reaching the exhaust. Every inch of that distance was an opportunity for the masonry to absorb heat, to drink it in, and hold it in the way that Poldark said the old Cornish engine houses held the heat of their boilers for days after the fires went out. Stone remembers fire. She could hear Everett's voice in the phrase now blended with Poldark's, as though the two men were speaking in unison across the divide between the living and the dead. The stove was ugly. It was brutal, primitive, a hulking clay and stone god crouched in the belly of the mountain. It looked nothing like the gleaming cast-iron peninsulas that sat in every parlor in Calumet Ridge. It looked like something from another age, an age before iron. An age when people understood that the earth was not their enemy, but their oldest, most patient ally. By the last week of October, the first snow had fallen on the ridge. Thin exploratory snow, the kind that melts by noon but carries a message. I am here. I am early. What comes next will be worse. Rowena stood at the tunnel entrance and looked down at the town. Smoke rose from every chimney, thin white columns that the wind tore apart and scattered. Each column represented a stove being fed. Each stove was burning wood that would not last. The mathematics of the coming winter were already being written in the sky, and the answer they were converging on was the same answer the cold always gave. Not enough, not nearly enough. She turned back into the tunnel. The lamplight was warm and steady. At the far end, the masonry heater sat against the granite wall, like a promise waiting to be tested. Poldark's miner's square lay on top of it, left there deliberately, a gift disguised as a forgotten tool. And somewhere on the far side of the ridge, Merritt Poldark sat on his porch. In the thin October light, looking toward the tunnel, he could no longer see through the falling snow. His hands rested on his crutch. His bad hip ached. And on his face, for the first time in years, there was an expression that someone who knew him very well might have recognized as the faintest, most reluctant beginning of hope. Before we continue, before we see whether this desperate gamble pays off, or whether Marcus Grieve was right all along, I want to pause and ask you something. How many times in your life have you been told there is only one right way to do something? One right way to build a house, to raise a child, to survive a winter? to live a life, and how many times has that one right way turned out to be nothing more than the way that everyone else was already failing at together? Tell me in the comments, and stay with me, because the storm is coming, and what happens next inside that mountain will change everything. You think you know about heat, about shelter, about the difference between shouting and telling a story. The first fire was a disaster. Rowena had done everything Poldark told her. She had rebuilt the flue at 45 degrees. She had widened the firebox throat. She had packed the mortar joints with the coarser sand he specified, working each seam with her thumb until it was smooth and tight. She had spent 11 days on the serpentine channels alone, laying brick after brick in the winding pattern he had sketched in the dirt with the tip of his crutch. 70 feet of internal pathway folded back and forth inside the body of the heater, like the intestines of some ancient beast. She had done everything right, except the damper. She lit the fire on the 1st of November, using seasoned birch she had split and dried under the cabin's leaking porch. She lit it the way Poldark had instructed, a small, fierce blaze, the wood stacked upright, to maximize airflow flames reaching for the firebox ceiling like desperate hands. The fire caught, it roared. The heat was immediate and intense, and for 30 seconds the draft pulled perfectly. Smoke vanishing into the first channel with a satisfying, hungry whisper. Then the smoke came back. It poured from the firebox mouth in a thick, acrid cloud that filled the chamber in seconds. Rowena grabbed Phoebe, shouted for Calder, and the three of them scrambled through the tunnel on hands and knees. Eyes streaming, lungs burning, emerging into the November air, gasping and retching. Phoebe was crying. Calder was not, but his face had gone the color of old ash. Rowena stood bent over with her hands on her knees, coughing smoke and bile, and felt the full weight of what she had done settle on her shoulders like a yoke made of iron. Hollis Grieve was right. The pile of mud and rock would never draw. She would fill the cave with smoke and suffocate. She had bet her children's lives on a dead man's journal and an old cripple's memories, and she had lost. She stood there for a long time. The smoke seeped from the tunnel entrance in lazy, mocking curls. Calder watched her. Phoebe clung to her skirt face, buried in the fabric. The wind came off the ridge carrying the first real cold of the season, a cold with edges, and it cut through her damp clothes and found the sweat on her skin and turned it to ice. She went back in, not because the fear had passed. The fear was a living thing in her chest, a rat gnawing at the base of her throat. She went back in because the alternative was the boarding house and the laundry, and the slow erasure of everything Everett had believed was possible, and that erasure was a death too, just a quieter one. She found the problem in 20 minutes. The damper stone, a flat piece of slate she had fitted into the junction between the firebox and the first horizontal channel, had shifted during the initial burn. The expansion of the heated brick had pushed it a quarter-inch out of alignment, just enough to block the transition from vertical to horizontal flow. The smoke, finding its path obstructed, had taken the path of least resistance back through the firebox mouth. A quarter-inch. The distance between survival and suffocation was a quarter-inch of misaligned slate. She chiseled a groove into the surrounding brick deep enough to hold the damper stone in place against thermal expansion. She mortared it with a thicker mix. She waited 2 days for the mortar to cure, 2 days during which she and the children slept in the cabin, with the wind playing its fingers through every gap in the walls like a pianist rehearsing scales. She lit the second fire on November 3rd. The draft caught. The smoke vanished into the channels. She weighted her hand on the firebox frame, feeling the vibration of the moving air, listening to the sound the smoke made as it traveled through the serpentine maze, a low, continuous murmur like a conversation held in another room. She waited 10 minutes, 20, an hour. The smoke did not return. But the heat did not come either, not yet. The masonry was cold, all that stone and brick and clay, a massive thermal sink that drank the fire's energy without giving anything back. It was like pouring water into dry sand. The fire burned for 2 hours and consumed itself, and the heater sat there inert, a monument to absorbed energy that refused to manifest. Rowena fed the children cold porridge and put them to bed. She sat beside the heater with her hand on its flank, the way you might sit beside a sick animal waiting for signs of life. The stone was cool, not cold, but cool. She pressed her ear against it. She could hear nothing. She closed her eyes. At 2 in the morning, she woke with her cheek still pressed against the brick. Something had changed. She could not identify it for a moment, could not locate the source of the difference. Then she felt it. The brick against her face was warm, not blazing, not dramatic, not the searing surface of a cast iron stove. A warmth that seemed to come from deep inside the masonry, pushing outward with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She pulled her hand back and held it an inch from the surface. She could feel it radiating a gentle invisible pressure against her palm, like standing near another person's body in a cold room. The heater was releasing what the fire had given it slowly, steadily, without urgency. The fire had been dead for 4 hours. The stone was telling its story. She pressed both palms against the heater and held them there and felt the warmth move into her hands and up through her wrists, and she said so quietly that only the stone could hear it. You remembered. By morning the chamber was 58 degrees, no fire burning, no wood consumed since the previous afternoon. The walls of the tunnel, which had always been cool to the touch, were now faintly warm heated, not by the air but by the radiation from the masonry mass, which was in turn warming the granite, which was in turn warming the walls, a cascade of stored energy passing from object to object like a story being retold. Calder woke and sat up in his bunk and said nothing for a long time. Then he pulled his blanket off and sat in his shirt sleeves. Phoebe did the same, though she was less deliberate about it, simply kicking the covers away in her sleep, the way children do when they are too warm. Too warm, in a cave, in November. In the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where the lake was already building its arsenal of weather, and the old miners were already talking about the winter ahead in the hushed, clipped sentences of men who have seen bad ones and believe this will be worse. Rowena sat on the floor of her underground room and watched her children sleep without shivering. The rat of fear in her chest was still there. It would always be there. But it was quieter now, and something else was growing around it, something with roots. Poldark came that afternoon. He did not ask how the fire had gone. He walked past her to the heater, placed his palm flat against the surface, held it there for 10 seconds and then moved to the wall and did the same. He checked the exhaust channel by holding a lit match near the fissure opening and watching the flame bend. He knelt with difficulty and examined the damper groove she had chiseled. You fixed the damper. It was not a question. She did not answer it. The groove is ugly. She did not answer that either. He ran his finger along the groove. Then he stood, took his crutch, and said without turning, "It will hold." He left. Rowena realized after he was gone that this was the first time he had said something about her work that was not a correction. It will hold. From Merritt, Poldark, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. November deepened. The days grew short and the light turned the color of pewter. The lake effect snows began, not the great storms yet, but the steady daily accumulation that the peninsula was famous for. 2 inches one day for the next. A relentless layering that buried fences and turned roads into suggestions. Rowena moved the last of their belongings from the cabin to the tunnel. The beds, the table, the few pots and utensils, Phoebe's stones, Everett's crate of journals. She hung a canvas over the entrance and fitted a crude wooden door behind it. She installed a small iron vent pipe near the floor, angled upward to the surface, which drew fresh air into the chamber, where it was warmed by the stone floor, before rising gently into the living space. The cabin stood empty above them. Its door hung open. Snow began to drift in through the gaps in the walls, settling on the packed earth floor, like a white cloth laid over a table that no one would eat at again. Calder stopped going to the school in town. This was not Rowena's decision. It was his. He came home one afternoon with a split lip and a torn collar, and the contained, compressed silence of a boy who has been humiliated in a way that cannot be repaired by comfort. He did not tell her what they had said. He did not need to. She had heard the phrase herself, whispered in the company store, spoken aloud in the saloon, repeated with the thoughtless cruelty of a community that has decided someone is no longer worth protecting. Mole people. The Datch moles. She did not insist he return to school. She taught him herself in the evenings by lamplight, using Everett's journals as textbooks. She taught him to read geological surveys. She taught him the names of minerals. She taught him to calculate volume and surface area, using the dimensions of the chamber they lived in. Practical mathematics made literal the area of their floor, the volume of their air, the cubic footage of stone that stood between them and the cold. He learned quickly. He learned the way Everett had learned, not by memorizing, but by understanding, by seeing the principle beneath the fact. He was 8 years old and he could explain thermal mass in plain language. The stove holds the heat and gives it back slow, like when you heat a rock in the fire and put it in your bed, but bigger. Rowena looked at him when he said this. She saw Everett's eyes, she saw Everett's mind, and she saw something else, something that was entirely Calder's own. A stubbornness that was not defensive but structural, built into him like a load-bearing wall. He had chosen his side. He would not be moved. Phoebe adapted the way 5-year-olds adapt to anything, which is to say completely and without commentary. The tunnel was her home. The heater was her hearth. She arranged her stones on the warm floor in patterns that grew more elaborate by the day. Circles, within circles, spiral shapes that might have been flowers or might have been maps of territories that existed only in her private cosmology. She talked to the walls. She named the stones. She was by every measure that mattered happy. Nella Grieve came for the second time on a night in mid-November, climbing the ridge path in the dark with a bundle under her arm. She brought wool, 3 skeins of good merino undyed, the kind that cost more than Rowena could have afforded in a year. She also brought a jar of rendered lard and a small cloth bag of dried rosemary from her own kitchen garden. She stood in the tunnel entrance holding the bundle against her chest and looked at the chamber beyond. The lamplight, the warm walls, the children asleep, the heater silent and radiating. "I can feel it from here," she said. Her voice was almost a whisper. "The heat, it's in the floor." Rowena took the bundle. Their hands touched. Nella's fingers were cold from the walk. Rowena's were warm. "Does Hollis know you're here?" "Hollis knows what Hollis needs to know." Nella did not stay long, but before she left, she stood for a moment with her palm against the tunnel wall. The same gesture Poldark made, the same gesture Rowena made every morning. A kind of greeting, a laying on of hands. Her face in the lamplight held an expression Rowena could not quite read. It was not pity, it was not admiration. It was something closer to recognition, as though she was seeing for the first time a version of shelter she had not known was possible. She came back the following week with salt pork and a pair of flannel-lined mittens sized for a child. Rowena did not ask who they were for. They fit Phoebe perfectly. The 3rd week of November brought the first real cold. Not the exploratory cold of early autumn, but the committed cold. The cold that settled into the landscape the way a predator settles into a crouch. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero and stayed there. The lake was not yet frozen, which meant the moisture machine was still running at full power, pulling water into the sky and dumping it on the peninsula in quantities that defied language. 4 feet of snow in 6 days. The drifts against the windward side of the company houses reached the eaves. Men went to work in the mines, not because they wanted to, but because the shafts were the only place warmer than their houses, the deep rock holding its 60-degree equilibrium, while the surface world above contracted into a white shrieking hell. In the tunnel, Rowena burned a small fire every 36 hours. 12 sticks of seasoned birch arranged vertically in the firebox burned hot for 90 minutes. The masonry absorbed the heat and released it over the next day and a half. The chamber held between 56 and 62 degrees. The air was clean. The fresh air vent drew steadily, bringing oxygen in at floor level, where it was warmed before it reached the breathing zone. There was no draft. There was no wind. There was the constant, gentle, omnidirectional warmth of a system that was not fighting the cold, but had simply opted out of the argument entirely. She used a quarter of the wood that any house in Calumet Ridge burned. A quarter. While the men of the town hauled sled after sled of cordwood from the company lumberyard, counting and recounting their diminishing reserves, Rowena's modest stack of birch beside the tunnel entrance barely shrank. Poldark noticed this before she did. He mentioned it one afternoon while watching her split kindling, an activity he supervised from a seated position on a stump with the critical attention of a judge at a livestock show. "How much have you burned since the first of the month?" she calculated. "A half cord, perhaps a little less." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Greaves' house takes 4 cord a month. I asked his man. He did not say anything else. He did not need to." The numbers spoke a language that required no translation. 4 cord against a half, 8-1. The iron stove, the well-built house, the best that conventional wisdom could offer, was consuming fuel at 8 times the rate of a pile of mud and rock built by a widow in a hole. The knowledge sat between them like a coal glowing. December came. The days were 5 hours long, the darkness a physical weight that pressed on the peninsula like a hand. The town turned inward. Doors stayed shut, windows frosted opaque. The saloons did steady business selling warmth in liquid form to men whose solid fuel warmth was running out. Fights broke out over firewood. A family on the south end of town, the Ostranders, burned their fence posts when their wood pile gave out. The smoke from their chimney smelled of creosote and desperation. On December 7th, Rowena baked bread. This was not a remarkable act. She had baked bread many times. But this bread was baked in a small oven she had built into the side of the masonry heater. A chamber of fire brick that held the residual heat of the last burn at exactly the right temperature for a slow, even bake. The loaf came out golden, crackled fragrant with the yeast starter she had kept alive since Everett's death, feeding it flour and water every 3 days like a small demanding pet. The smell of it filled the tunnel, warm and alive, and when she broke it open, the steam that rose from the soft interior carried something that was not just heat, but a kind of declaration. We are here. We are warm. We are fed. We are not dying. She did not know it yet, but the smell of that bread would travel. Scent does not respect boundaries. It moves through canvas doors and up ventilation shafts and out into the cold air where it disperses but does not quite disappear. A hunter passing on the ridge trail that evening would later tell his wife that he had smelled baking bread in the middle of the forest a mile from any house and had thought he was losing his mind. He was not losing his mind. He was smelling the future. On December 14th, Hollis Greaves' boy came to the ridge. His name was Porter. He was 2 years older than Calder, broad for his age, with his father's heavy jaw and his father's certainty. He was the one who had started calling Calder Mole Boy. He was the one who had led the circle of children in the schoolyard, who had pushed Calder into the mud and laughed when he did not cry. He was in the specific and merciless hierarchy of a mining town's children. The authority and his authority rested on the same foundation as his father's. The conviction that he was right, because everyone who mattered agreed with him. He came alone, which was unusual. He came on foot through waist-deep snow, which was more than unusual. It was punishing. He was red-faced and breathing hard when he reached the tunnel entrance, and his coat, which was a good wool coat, the best a foreman's son could have, was soaked through with sweat and snowmelt. He stood at the entrance and did not go in. He stood there for a long time, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his breath pluming in the air. Then Calder came out. The two boys looked at each other. Porter's face worked through several expressions, none of which settled. Finally, he spoke, and what he said was not what he had planned to say. You could see that in the way the words surprised him as they came out, as though someone else were using his mouth. "Is it true your ma's cave is warm?" Calder said nothing for a moment. "Then it's not a cave, it's a house." "It doesn't look like a house." "A house is where you sleep warm. You can call it what you want." Porter stood in the snow. He was shivering. His good wool coat was failing him the way all coats eventually fail in this country, not because they are bad coats, but because no coat is a match for cold that has decided to stay. He looked at the dark entrance to the tunnel. He looked at Calder, who was standing in shirt sleeves. In shirt sleeves. In December. On a ridge in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. "Can I come in?" Calder stepped aside. Porter entered the tunnel, and the cold fell away from him in layers like clothing being removed. 10 feet in the biting edge was gone. 20 feet in the chill was gone. 30 feet in, he was sweating in his soaked coat and had to take it off. At the chamber, he stopped and stared. The warm walls, the lamp, the heater enormous and silent. Phoebe on the floor with her stones, the smell of bread and something savory. A stew venison and root vegetables simmering in a pot that sat on the masonry surface, cooking without fire heated by the stored energy of yesterday's burn. He put his hand on the wall. He pulled it back. He put it on the wall again. "This is warm." "Yes," Calder said. "The rock is warm." "Yes." "How?" Calder did not answer the way his mother would have answered, with the physics of thermal mass and radiant heat and geothermal stability. He answered the way an 8-year-old answers, which is to say, with the truth stripped of all its adult complexity. "My pa found out the mountain is warm inside. My ma built a stove that remembers the fire after the fire goes out. That's all." Porter stayed for an hour. He ate a piece of bread. He took off his boots and let them dry by the heater. He did not apologize for the name-calling, or the pushing, or the mud. He did not need to. The apology was in the hour itself. In the bread he ate, in the way he sat on the warm floor with his stockinged feet tucked under him, and looked around the chamber with the bewildered, recalibrating expression of a boy whose map of the world has just been redrawn. When he left, Calder walked him to the tunnel entrance. Porter put on his coat, which was dry now, warm from the heater's radiation. He stepped into the snow, and the cold hit him like a wall. He turned back. "I won't call you that anymore." Calder nodded. He did not say thank you. Thank you would have been a concession. He simply nodded the way Poldark nodded, the nod of someone who has noted a fact and filed it in its proper place. Porter walked down the ridge. Halfway to the town, he stopped and looked back at the tunnel entrance. From outside, it was nothing. A dark mouth in a snow-covered hillside. A hole. A folly. Inside it was 60 degrees. He told his father that evening. He told him about the warm walls and the bread and the boy in shirt sleeves. He told him about the stove that remembered fire. Hollis Grieve listened with the expression of a man being told that water runs uphill. He listened the way you listen to a child's fantasy, with patience and an internal shake of the head. He said, "Eat your supper, Porter," and he said nothing more. But that night, lying in bed beside his wife with the cast-iron stove in the next room ticking as it cooled, and the temperature in the house already beginning its nightly slide toward freezing, Hollis Grieve lay awake. He stared at the ceiling. He listened to the wind testing his walls, probing his joints, measuring his weaknesses with the meticulous patience of an engineer. And he thought about a boy in shirt sleeves. The storm arrived on December 19th. It did not come from the west the way prairie storms come, as a visible wall advancing across the horizon. It came from the north, from the lake, and it came vertically. The sky did not darken. It lowered. The clouds dropped until they were indistinguishable from the ground, and the world became a single undifferentiated substance, part air, part ice, part fury, that obliterated all boundaries between earth and sky. The wind did not moan. It shrieked. It was a sound that entered the body through the chest rather than the ears, a deep percussive roar that vibrated in the ribs and made the heart stutter. It drove the snow horizontally, then vertically, then in spirals that seemed to defy physics. Trees snapped. Roof lines that had stood for decades began to groan under loads they were never designed to bear. The temperature dropped through zero. and kept falling 10 below, 20 below, 30 below, each degree a ratchet click in a mechanism that would not stop until it had tested every structure, every wall, every joint, every living thing in its path, and found the ones that were insufficient. Inside the Grieve house, the war began immediately and was lost almost as fast. Hollis fed the peninsula stove until its sides glowed dull red. The heat rose to the ceiling in a column so hot it made the air shimmer. And the heat left. It left through the roof, through the ridge beam, through the 100 tiny gaps that 19 years of Michigan winters had opened in the tongue and groove pine. It left, and the cold came in to replace it. Sliding under the doors, rising through the floorboards, pressing through the window glass, which was no longer transparent, but armored in a quarter-inch of crystalline ice that grew inward from the edges like a living thing. The stack effect, the very principle that made his stove work, was now working against him. The column of rising hot air creating a vacuum at floor level that sucked Arctic air into the house through every crack and seam. His stove was a pump, pulling the cold inside as fast as it pushed the heat out. He was heating the storm. By the second day, he was burning furniture. The kitchen chair went first, then the side table, then the crate he kept kindling in. The green pine he had split as backup burned poorly, filling the house with a choking tarry smoke that made his youngest daughter cough until she retched. Mary Grieve sat on the bed with Porter and the girls wrapped in every blanket and coat they owned, their shivering a mechanical, involuntary rhythm that did not stop even in sleep. Hollis stood at the stove and fed it, and watched the heat vanish and fed it again, and knew with the quiet, devastating clarity of a man who understands structures that his house was failing. Not because it was poorly built, because it was built on a principle that could not survive this. He thought about the tunnel. He did not want to think about it. He pushed the thought away the way you push away a hand offering help you do not deserve. But it came back the way warmth comes back from stone, slowly, patiently refusing to be dismissed. A boy in shirt sleeves, in December. The storm would rage for 4 days, and somewhere in the howling, lightless chaos of the second night, while Hollis Grieve burned the last of his dry wood and listened to his daughter's cough, a single thought formed in his mind. It was not a thought he wanted. It was not a thought he could afford. But it was there, and it was warm, and it would not leave. What if she was right? On the third morning of the storm, Hollis Grieve stopped feeding the stove. Not because he chose to, because there was nothing left to feed it. The last chair was ash. The green pine was gone. The kindling crate was gone. He stood in front of the cold iron box and looked at it, at its dead belly, its cooling flanks, the thin web of frost already forming on its surface like a second skin. And he understood something that he had spent 19 years refusing to understand. He had worshipped a false god. The stove had promised heat. It had delivered heat. But the heat had always been borrowed, a frantic transaction between fuel and air that lasted only as long as the fuel lasted. And now the fuel was gone, and the stove was just iron cold. Iron, 700 pounds of shaped metal that gave back nothing, because it had nothing to give. It had no memory. It had shouted its heat into the room, and the room had shouted it into the storm, and the storm had swallowed it without acknowledgement. 3 days of burning, and the house was colder than it had been at the start. Mary and the girls were in the bed. They had stopped shivering sometime in the night, and this absence of shivering frightened Hollis more than the shivering itself, because he knew what it meant. The body shivers to generate heat. When it stops shivering, it has given up. He put on his heaviest coat. He put on his boots. He told Mary he was going for help, which was a lie. But it was the last lie he had the energy for, and it was kinder than the truth, which was that he was going to the ridge to find out whether the Datch widow and her children were dead. He needed to know. The guilt had been a thought for weeks. Now it was a physical thing, a stone lodged behind his ribs that made every breath an act of accounting. He had told her not to call for help. He had washed his hands, and now his hands were shaking inside his gloves, not from the cold, but from the weight of what those clean hands might have caused. The door would not open. Snow had drifted against it to a height of 5 feet. He put his shoulder into it and shoved until the frame cracked and a wedge of white spilled across the floor. The cold that entered was not air. It was a substance dense and sharp, a medium that filled the lungs like ground glass and turned exposed skin to parchment in seconds. He forced himself through the gap and into the storm. The world was gone. There was no town. There was no ridge. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. There was only white, a churning, roaring, undifferentiated white that erased everything it touched. He navigated by memory, by the angle of the wind, by counting his steps. The snow was waist-deep in the open and chest-deep in the drifts, and every step was a negotiation with a substance that did not want him to move. His legs burned. His lungs burned. The scarf across his face froze solid within minutes, a mask of ice through which he breathed in shallow, agonized sips. The walk to the ridge was normally 20 minutes. It took him an hour and a half. He fell 4 times. The 4th time he stayed down for a while lying in the snow, looking up at the white nothing, and considered not getting up. The cold was no longer painful. It was warm. This was the final lie the cold tells, the gentlest and most lethal. The whisper that says, "Stop fighting. Lie down. Rest. It will be over soon." He recognized the lie because he had heard it described by miners who had been pulled from collapsed shafts. And he got up. Not because he wanted to, but because he was Hollis Grieve, and he did not lie down. He saw the cabin first, or what remained of it. The roof had buckled under the snow. The ridge beam snapped clean, the 2 halves of the cedar shake roof folded inward like the covers of a closed book. Snow filled the interior. The door hung open on one hinge. There was no smoke, no light, no sign of occupation. It was a dead thing, a husk, the shed skin of a life that had moved on. They were gone. Dead or gone, and in this storm, the distinction was academic. He stood in front of the ruined cabin, and the stone behind his ribs grew until it filled his entire chest. He had been right about the cabin. It had not survived. But being right about the cabin meant being wrong about the woman, because if the cabin had killed her, then his advice had been correct and his conscience was clean. But if the cabin had not killed her, if she had abandoned it for something else, something he had condemned, something he had called a tomb. He turned toward the eastern slope. The tunnel entrance was 200 yards away, invisible in the storm. He did not expect to find it. He did not expect to find anything. He walked toward it because there was nothing else to walk toward. He almost missed it. The entrance was buried under a drift, the wooden door completely submerged. But the ventilation pipe, the small iron tube Rowena had angled up through the rock to the surface, was still clear, kept open by the warm air rising through it. And from that pipe, from that 6-inch circle of iron protruding from the snow, there rose a shimmer. Not smoke, not steam. A distortion in the air, a trembling, the way heat rises from a summer road, visible only because the air around it was so brutally cold that even a few degrees of difference created a lens. Warm air, rising from the earth, in the middle of the worst storm in the recorded history of the Upper Peninsula. He fell to his knees beside the pipe. He held his frozen hands over the opening and felt the breath of the mountain on his skin, gentle, steady, impossibly warm. He clawed at the snow around the entrance with hands he could no longer feel. He found the door. He pulled it open. The warmth hit him like a wave. It came from everywhere. From the floor, from the walls, from the ceiling of the tunnel, from the stone itself. It was not the sharp directional heat of a stove. It was encompassing, maternal, a warmth that surrounded and held and did not let go. It entered through his frozen clothing and found his skin, and he gasped not from pain, but from the shock of the difference, the absolute annihilating contrast between the world he had left and the world he had entered. He crawled. His legs would not carry him. He crawled through the tunnel on his hands and knees, the way Rowena had crawled the first time, and with every foot the cold retreated further behind him, until it was not retreating, but simply absent, a memory, a rumor from another country. He rounded the bend, and the chamber opened before him. Lamplight golden and steady. The table set with 2 tin plates and 2 tin cups. The children's bunks against the wall, blankets folded neatly. Phoebe stones arranged in a spiral pattern on the warm floor. The pot of stew on the masonry surface simmering without flame. And the heater. The massive, ugly, magnificent heater, silent and radiating a heart of stored heat, beating its slow, patient rhythm into the room. Rowena sat at the table mending a tear in Calder's shirt. Phoebe slept on her bunk, one arm hanging off the edge, fingers trailing on the floor. Calder sat cross-legged near the heater, reading one of Everett's journals, his lips moving as he worked through the technical language. They were in shirt sleeves. Merritt Poldark sat in the corner on a stool, whittling a piece of birch into a shape that might have been a bird or might have been a handle for something. His crutch leaned against the wall beside him. His bad leg was stretched out on a folded blanket. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man sitting in his own home. Hollis Grieve knelt in the entrance to this impossible room, this warm, bright living space carved out of the body of the mountain, and his mind did what it had refused to do for 3 months. It broke. Not violently, quietly. The way ice breaks in the spring, not with a crack but with a long, slow yielding the accumulated pressure of an entire winter, releasing all at once in a sound that is almost like a sigh. Everything he knew was wrong. Not everything he knew about building. He could still drive a nail and through a wall and cut a rafter to the proper pitch. But everything he knew about heat, about shelter, about the fundamental relationship between a house and the cold, it was built to resist all of it, was wrong. His iron stove was a shout. This masonry heater was a conversation. His well-built house was a sieve. This tunnel was a vessel. He had spent 19 years perfecting a system that was designed at its core to lose. He tried to speak. His lips were cracked. His throat was raw. His vocal cords, frozen from the walk, produced a sound that was barely human. How? Rowena set down her sewing. She looked at him, at the ice in his eyebrows, at the frost on his collar, at the broken expression on a face that had never in all the years she had known it shown anything but certainty. There was no triumph in her eyes, no vindication, no "I told you so." There was something far more dangerous to a proud man than any of these things. There was compassion. "You fought the winter, Mr. Grieve. I asked the mountain for shelter. Your stove shouts its heat, and the wind steals the words. My hearth tells a story to the stone, and the stone remembers." She stood. She went to the heater. She picked up the loaf of bread she had baked that morning, the crust still holding the faint warmth of the masonry. She walked to where he knelt and broke the bread and held it out the way you hold something out to a man who has been lost for a long time and has finally come home. "You are cold. Eat." He took the bread. Its warmth entered his fingers, his palms, his wrists. He ate it, and the warmth entered his body, and the tears came. Not the mechanical weeping of a man performing grief, but the real, raw, ungovernable tears of a man who has discovered that the foundation he built his life on was sand. Poldark watched from his corner. He did not speak. He did not need to. The birch shaving curled away from his knife in a long pale ribbon, and the sound of the blade on the wood was the only sound in the room. Besides Hollis Grieve's weeping and the gentle, relentless, patient warmth of the stone. When the storm broke on the 4th day, a new world lay beneath it. Calumet Ridge was crippled. 2 company houses on the north end had collapsed under the snow load. A dozen people had severe frostbite. The town's communal woodpile, which the company maintained for emergencies, was gone. The miners emerged from their shafts and their houses, blinking and stunned survivors of a siege they had not expected to survive. And on the ridge above them, from the dark mouth of a hole they had called a folly, a thin wisp of shimmer rose into the clearing sky. Not smoke, heat, the mountain exhaling. Hollis Grieve returned to the tunnel 3 days after the storm with 4 men, none of whom carried rescue supplies. They carried measuring tapes, notebooks, and the focused, humbled attention of men who have been shown that the thing they thought they knew, they did not know at all. Grieve spent 2 full days inside the tunnel. He measured the flue channels with a string and a weight. He sketched the firebox dimensions. He noted the clay composition of the mortar and the angle of every joint. He pressed his palm against the heater and held it there, feeling the warmth push into his hand, and he wrote in his notebook the temperature, the duration, the fuel consumed. And beside these figures, in a hand that was no longer quite steady, the words 8 to 1, 8 to 1. We never had a chance. He asked Poldark questions. Poldark answered them in the flat, economical sentences of a man who has no interest in being impressive and every interest in being precise. Draft velocity, thermal conductivity, the specific heat of granite versus limestone versus fired clay. The old Cornishman sat on his stool with his bad leg straight and his crutch across his lap, and delivered 40 years of accumulated knowledge in an afternoon. And Hollis Grieve, the man who had built every proper structure in Calumet Ridge, sat at his feet and wrote it down like a student. He did not ask Rowena's permission to learn. He asked for her advice. The distinction was everything. He came to her with his measurements and his sketches, and he said, "Is this right?" And she looked at his work and told him where he was wrong, and where he was close, and where he had understood something she had not understood herself until she built it. She ran her hand over his drawings the way she ran her hand over the stone, looking for the flaw, finding it, pointing to it without judgment, teaching the way Poldark had taught her, by correction, by precision, by the absolute refusal to let a mistake stand because it was convenient. That summer, Calumet Ridge began to change. Under Hollis Grieve's direction, 3 families dug into the hillside and built partially subterranean homes with masonry heaters at their cores. Grieve supervised the construction himself, but the designs were Rowena's, drawn in charcoal on brown paper, annotated in Everett's shorthand, refined by Poldark's corrections. The town called them Datch hearths, though Rowena never called them anything. They were heaters. They worked. By the following winter, 5 more families had built them. The families that had Datch hearths burned 1/8 the wood of those that did not. Their homes held a steady 58 to 62 degrees through the worst cold. No one who lived in a Datch hearth house lost a finger or a toe to frostbite that year. No one's child coughed through the night from creosote smoke. No one burned their furniture. Rowena did not seek recognition. She did not want it. She raised her children in the warm room Everett's journals had shown her how to build. She taught Calder the things Everett would have taught him if the mountain had not taken him. She watched Phoebe grow, watched her stone arrangements become drawings, watched the drawings become plans, watched the girl develop the same instinct for space and structure that had lived in her father. Poldark died in the spring of 1884 in his cabin on the far side of the ridge. They found him in his chair with a half-finished carving in his lap, and his tools laid out on the table in the precise order he always kept them. He had left no will, no family, no instructions. But on the wall above his workbench, written in carpenter's pencil in letters so small you had to lean close to read them, were 7 words. She fixed the damper. It will hold. Years passed. The technique spread beyond Calumet Ridge to other mining towns along the Keweenaw Peninsula. A professor from the Michigan School of Mines came to study the Datch hearth and published a paper that used words like thermodynamic efficiency and passive geothermal integration, which were accurate descriptions of something Rowena had built with her hands in the dark while her children slept. She never read the paper. She would not have recognized the language. She knew only what the stone knew, which was that fire was not an event but a gift. And the proper response to a gift was not to spend it immediately, but to hold it carefully for as long as possible and release it slowly in the dark when it was needed most. Decades later, long after Rowena was gone and Calder had become a mining engineer, and Phoebe had married a schoolteacher in Marquette, and the tunnel on the ridge had been sealed, and half-forgotten newcomers to Calumet Ridge would notice the unusual architecture. The houses built into hillsides, the massive stone hearths at their centers, the way the town seemed to hunker into the landscape instead of standing against it, as though it had learned at some point in its history that the earth was not an enemy, but a collaborator. They would ask about the hearths and an old resident, perhaps. Porter grieved grey-haired now and thick through the shoulders, like his father would take them up the ridge to the sealed entrance of the old tunnel. He would show them the brass plate that the mining school had bolted to the rock, and he would read the inscription which was taken from the last page of a leather journal found inside. Wood gives fire, but stone gives warmth. One is a shout, the other a story. Always listen to the story. Everett Datch, 1881. And below the plate, scratched into the granite with a chisel in a hand that had once been steadier, but was still precise, still deliberate still. The hand of a man who believed that if a thing was worth saying, it was worth carving into rock, were 3 words. Stone remembers fire, Monsieur Poldark. The visitor would touch the cold granite. And the granite even in winter, even with the tunnel sealed. And the heater dark, and the woman who built it long gone would be faintly, impossibly warm. So let me ask you this. What is the tunnel in your life that everyone has told you not to enter? What is the knowledge you inherited that the world has dismissed as folly? What is the quiet warmth buried 60 feet beneath the noise of conventional wisdom, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig? Your mountain is not your enemy. Your mountain has been waiting. All it asks is that you stop shouting and start listening. Because somewhere in the stone there is a story, and the stone remembers. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters and specific events are fictional, created to illustrate a principle. The content presented here is for narrative and entertainment purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified experts before undertaking any construction or shelter building projects.